My name is Erin Renfro. I use the pronoun she and her, and I will be your service leader this morning. I want to take a few minutes to welcome everyone who has joined us today by Facebook Live. This is not the ideal way to do things, but we are glad you were able to join us today and hope you will continue to do so. Our Unitarian heritage calls us to recognize the inherent good of all persons, while the Universalist part of our tradition encourages us to extend love and acceptance to all people. You are welcome in a Unitarian Universalist congregation, whatever your gender identity, sexual orientation, racial identity, or class. Our principles call us to affirm the worth and dignity of every individual, to accept one another, and to foster each other's spiritual growth. Our opening words this morning come from Michael A. Schuler. Cherish your doubts, for doubt is the servant of truth. Question your convictions, for beliefs too tightly held strangle the mind and its natural wisdom. Suspect all certitudes, for the world whirls on, nothing abides. Yet in our inner rooms full of doubt, inquiry and suspicion, let a corner be reserved for trust. For without trust, there is no space for communities to gather or for friendships to be forged. Indeed, this is the small corner where we connect and reconnect with each other. Our chalice lighting words today are by William Ellery Channing. I call that mind free, which jealously guards its intellectual rights and powers, which calls no one master, which does not content itself with a passive or hereditary faith, which opens itself to light whensoever it may come, which receives new truth as an angel from heaven. And now, if you will, recite the words of our congregational covenant with me today. Love is the spirit of this church, and service its law. This is our covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. And now we have a short time for all ages. So if kids would get in front of the screen, we have something that will appeal to everyone, I hope. It is called Free and Responsible Beliefs by Martha Dallas. I'm curious to know what you believe about what is the best food. That's mine. Think about that for a moment. And if you're wondering what I mean exactly, I leave it to each of you to interpret as you choose. What do you believe is the best food? How would you describe it in one word? Sweet? Crunchy? Tangy? Green? If we were all here together, I would ask a few of you to shout out what you think is the best food. And I imagine we would have quite a diversity of beliefs, and that would not surprise me at all. Now, I wonder if we could all come back together here in 10 years or 20 years, and I asked you the same thing. What do you think is the best food? Whether you would think the same thing you're thinking today. I believe for many of you, perhaps even most of you, that the food you believe is the best today will not be what you believe for the rest of your life. I believe it's very possible for that best food to get knocked from its throne and replaced by a different food, a new best food. So what has to happen in order for this to occur? Maybe you travel and try food from another country you've never been to before. Does anyone know what that is? That's poutine. It's good stuff, believe it or not. Maybe your best friend brings something new in their lunchbox and you get to try it and really like it. We as Unitarian Universalists really value the freedom each of us has to believe about not just things that we think is the best food, but about bigger things like, why are we here? What is the meaning of our lives? What's most important and valuable to me? How can I be most true to the purpose I see for my being alive in the world? We affirm the freedom to believe what we choose about these things, but we also have the responsibility to work out those beliefs with thought and care. Can we believe anything we want? No. But we do believe what our hearts and minds tell us is right. Thank goodness we don't have to do this all by ourselves. No, we are fortunate to have one another to help us try out our beliefs. It's like we can offer one another tastes of ideas that we think feel true. It's like together we each bring our best food to share at a potluck. We each bring our treasured beliefs to share with one another here in our congregation. We can put several on our plate. First, the ones we're confident we like, and then maybe we can go back for seconds for a chance to try something that our friends recommend is really yummy. And sometimes those new, yummy tastes will become favorites. Our congregation is supported solely by the donations of members and friends. We will now gratefully accept an offering to further the work of this church within and beyond its walls. This is the time in our service when we share the joys and sorrows that have been shared with us via email this last week. So I'd like to light a candle for those that have been sent to us. Emma Mulvaney sends to us that she would like us to remember 2 Santa Rosa School District teachers that passed away last week. Jennifer Adams, a teacher for 30 years, and one of May's teachers in the 3rd grade. And Travis Barnes, a middle school teacher in former neighbor of the Mulvaney's. Maeve played with his son until they moved to another neighborhood last year. Please keep both families in your thoughts. Our new member, Chris Brockaway, and her family have a sorrow. Chris's mother passed away unexpectedly due to complications from a routine procedure. So we will light a candle for them and their family. We'd like to offer continued thoughts, prayers, and personal encouragement to Hannah Laura Musial as she heals from back injury and surgery, and along with thanks to Linda Cobb, who has taken the lead in making sure that she is cared for during this time. And it was passed along to us in the last board meeting that Kay and Monty Mountcastle are going through a time of particular discouragement. So I imagine if you know them, a phone call or a card would be welcome. I'm going to light a candle also for all of our friends and members of the congregation who are living in isolation at this time and who don't have the resources to join us virtually. I'm sure if you know someone like that they would appreciate being reached out to. And I will light one more candle. Oh, I'm sorry, I almost missed one. Betty Myers, who has been trying for a very long time to schedule cataract surgery. That surgery has finally been scheduled, and she would appreciate your thoughts and prayers for healing. And now I will light one last candle for those joys and concerns we hold in our hearts, but were not shared this morning. And now I am going to invite Scott Satterwhite to the podium. I have asked him to take the heavy honor of reading out the names of his brothers in arms.
As a part of our service, each week when applicable, we read aloud the names of those who have recently died while on duty with one of the armed services. These men and women have died in Afghanistan. We also remember their families and friends, as well as the thousands of Iraqi and Afghan civilians, military and police, who have been injured and killed in the wars. Maxton W. Sovayak, hospital corpsman, U.S. Navy, age 22, from Berlin Heights, Ohio. Kareem M. McCoy, Lance Corporal, U.S. Marines, age 20, from Norco, California. David Lee Espinosa, Lance Corporal, U.S. Marines, age 20, from Rio Bravo, Texas. Riley J. McCullum, Lance Corporal, U.S. Marines, age 20, from Jackson, Wyoming. Jared M. Schmidt, Lance Corporal, U.S. Marines, age 20, from St. Charles, Missouri. Hunter Lopez, Corporal, U.S. Marines, age 22, from Indio, California. Darren Taylor Hoover, Jr., Staff Sergeant, U.S. Marines, age 31, from Salt Lake City, Utah. Deegan William Tyler Page, Corporal, U.S. Marine, age 23, from Omaha, Nebraska. Joanny Rosario, Sergeant, U.S. Marines, age 25, from Lawrence, Massachusetts. Nicole L.G., Sergeant, U.S. Marines, age 23, from Sacramento, California. Humberto A. Sanchez, Corporal, U.S. Marines, age 22, from Logansport, Indiana. Dylan R. Marola, Lance Corporal, U.S. Marines, age 20, from Rancho Cucamonga, California. And Ryan C. Noss, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army, age 23, from Corrington, Tennessee. Hopefully, those are the last ones.
Thank you. And now we will enjoy the message from the Reverend Angela Herrera at First Unitarian Church in Albuquerque.
I'm going to start out with a question for those of you who are regulars here. Are we religious? Is Unitarian Universalism a religion? Yes, okay. I mean, this is a church, right? Some people have had their doubts about this. It's called First Unitarian Church, and it's yours. Does that make you religious? I'm guessing many of you do not describe yourself that way. I mean, I'm an ordained minister, and I rarely describe myself as a religious person, although I do think it would be accurate to call me one. The problem has to do with the connotation that the word has picked up over the years. Religious sounds like somebody whose religion sets them apart from others in worldview and perhaps also in appearance and practice. I'm thinking of Ned Flanders here, right? Simpsons. It reminds me of people I've known who, if you exchanged more than a couple of words with them, were likely to start talking about God and too often, I'm afraid, felt an urgent need to convert others to their belief system, right? Not everybody who's religious is pushy, of course not. But that is one pretty strong connotation of religiousness in the United States, right? It has to do with the idea that to be religious is to accept a particular belief system, a set of creeds and authoritative church teachings, what is called dogma, having to do with a supernatural God. And in Unitarian Universalist churches, or UU churches for short, we don't have any particular creed. And although we teach values, there's not a set of official teachings that we expect you to receive as authoritative and final. So if that's what being religious is, then we would have to say that Unitarian Universalism is not a religion. And yet, religion's not as easy to define as that. You knew I wasn't going to just let it go at that, right? The Islamist scholar and religious historian William Graham, who was dean of Harvard Divinity School, once said that even he isn't really sure what a religion is. The dean of Harvard Divinity School, you guys. Not sure what religion is. The thing is that in most of the world's languages, there's no equivalent for what we call religion in the Western world. And here I mean what we in the dominant culture of the Western world call religion. Deen in Arabic, that's translated as religion, but it really just means the right way, and it's more specific than the word religion is in English. What we call religion here might be called dharma in Buddhist countries. Dharma means the teachings, but then what about the practices? And Buddhism doesn't include a supernatural God. The mind and its thoughts and beliefs are a central concern of the Western world. Think about the philosopher Descartes saying, "I think, therefore I am," right? And so Christianity, which has played a dominant role in the development of Western thought, has come to be characterized mainly as the acceptance of a set of beliefs, a creed. This very Western notion that religion is primarily about beliefs has been taken for granted to the point that Western thinkers tend to assume all religions are the same way. And accordingly, some people have questioned whether this, Unitarian Universalism, fits the bill. Even some UUs have raised this question. But I remember the year I spent as a chaplaincy intern at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, where there was a huge Catholic population. To my surprise, I quickly learned that when somebody's medical chart said Catholic on it, I'd better just go in curious and listen carefully, because I could not necessarily predict their beliefs. I've met Catholics who believed in reincarnation and others who were Universalists. I've accompanied more than one Catholic to an abortion. These individuals did not agree with the official creed and doctrine of their church, and yet they still identified with it, and people who knew them also certainly still thought of them as Catholic. So obviously there's more to religion than creeds and dogma, but how do we properly define it? Some scholars, like Joseph Campbell, have noted that one possible root of the word religion is ligare, which means to bind or to connect. And so religare, religion, would be to reconnect or to bind back. That sounds like reconnecting with the source of all being from which we were born, and that's a beautiful idea. But linguists are skeptical. In the end, the word's roots are foggy, leaving us with the sense that the word gets at some important dimension of our humanness, but we're just not quite sure what it is. Maybe the simplest way to speak of it is to say that there's more to life than meets the eye. More to life than meets the eye. What I mean is that we are more than just mere objects, right? On the most scientific level, we are also phenomena, processes and experiences. We think, imagine, remember, and love, and we make meaning. We're meaning makers. In order to thrive, we need to have a sense of what our lives are for. Sometimes we speak of this more than meets the eye as the depth aspect of life. That is what religion is about. And Unitarian Universalism is a religion, yes. And it might be that this makes you religious. I'll let you be the judge of that. For now, I'm going to turn from the question of what is a religion and are we one to the question of what kind of religion this is. Typically, for Unitarian Universalists, it feels a little easier to say what we aren't, like what we don't do or don't believe, than to say what we do believe, right? We don't have creeds. You don't have to commit to a certain set of unchanging beliefs in order to be a UU. We don't preach that people are going to hell. We don't proselytize. We don't think a person has to become a Unitarian Universalist in order to be saved, although we would love it if they did become one. Sometimes I've heard the history of Unitarian Universalism told in a similar way, told in terms of all the things our religious ancestors rejected. It's like a parade of heresies. But I see it differently. So, imagine that I'm standing in front of a big chalkboard, right? And I'm gonna write a big wavy line all the way across it. This is what one of my professors used to do when I was an undergraduate student. On the far right side, we have the present over here. By the way, backing up just a smidge, if you were here on March 6th, 2011, and you have a really good memory, you might recognize some parts of this sermon, which was adapted from the one I gave on that day. Moving backward through time, we have significant events in world thought, and especially in the development of Western thought. The Enlightenment, the Renaissance, Martin Luther, and Protestantism. We just celebrated the 500th anniversary of that last month. We have the Dark Ages and early Christianity, the life of Jesus, the Axial Age, when Confucius, Buddha, Lao Tzu, Zarathustra, Plato, Socrates, and the prophets of the Hebrew Bible all appeared on the world stage within 600 years of each other, changing history forever. And way over here, on the far left, we have prehistory. Over on this side, we have story, but not history. It's the time of the Garden of Eden, the time of Abraham and Sarah and Moses, and people living to be 200 years old, and Greek gods and other gods coming right down to the earth to get involved in human affairs. It's the time of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story, and the Epic of Gilgamesh, a Sumerian legend. And even further out, just beyond the reach of most human stories, is humankind's birth. The birth of the first humans on the African continent and those early, distant generations. And really, the line could go all the way up to Placidus with the time before humans appeared, right? We're just like this on the world's timeline. But we'll just stay with where we've existed. We don't know exactly at what point our human ancestors first began asking existential questions. We do know that archaeologists have discovered Neanderthal burial sites with precisely arranged tools, weapons, and other objects in them, not as though the person or the Neanderthal fell over dead with the items in their hands, but as though others who cared about them or about him or her had thoughtfully arranged them during some kind of a burial ceremony. It seems to suggest belief in an afterlife. Why else would you bury useful tools and special objects with the dead? Neanderthals predated humans, so we don't know when humans began thinking that there's more to life than meets the eye, but we can guess that it was very, very early in the development of our species, when they noticed the solar and lunar cycles and how death and life were interconnected in the food chain and in the forests, when they began to experience love and give it a name. That's where the story of Unitarian Universalism begins. It's where the development of all faith and thought traditions begin, in the time of prehistory, of story, and of wondering about the source and the meaning of life. Those early questions evolved into many traditions, some of which are depicted on our mural behind me, because they're all valuable. Out of that beginning also came the stories and practices and ways of making meaning that would intertwine with the story and teachings of Jesus and be passed down and reinterpreted by each generation. If you keep following the lines of thought and tradition that blossomed from that time, so many of them, if you keep following them, eventually a few of them twist together and they form one strong thread over here, Unitarian Universalism. One big-hearted, justice-loving, diversity-embracing evolution of the meaning-making that began in prehistory. Along the way, our UU threads weave through the history of Judaism and Christianity. Many people are surprised to learn that in the first few hundred years after Jesus died, there was a lot of theological diversity among his followers. Not everybody agreed about the resurrection, for example, or whether he was divine. Each of his disciples had heard him in their own way, and each carried his teachings forward with slightly different angles. The stories about him that were eventually included in the biblical canon, the official Bible, are just the stories that were included in the canon. Many more were left out, some of which have been recovered and published in recent decades, like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Eventually, a group of powerful men with powerful connections developed the Nicene Creed, a theology that involved, among other things, the idea of the Trinity and the existence of heaven and hell. Let us pause here to acknowledge that Unitarian Universalism challenges those points by its very name. Unitarianism is the idea that God, or our source, is one, and Universalism is a belief that all will be reconciled with that source in the end. UUs tend not to believe in a literal physical place called hell. We do recognize that humans have found many ways to create hell on earth, sometimes for ourselves and sometimes for each other. If you wanted to describe our faith in its simplest terms, you could probably just use that. Unitarian Universalists believe that all people are one family from one source, and all will be reconciled with that source. But we have a little more time. And I'll bet you're curious about how we got from there to here. Our first notable ancestor after Jesus is Origen, a famous 3rd century theologian from Alexandria, Egypt. When he was 17, Origen tried to become a martyr for Christianity, but his mother, who had already lost Origen's father to martyrdom, and who had spent 17 years raising this passionate boy of hers, had no intention of literally throwing all that effort to the lions, so she hid his clothing so he couldn't leave the house. Stuck at home with no pants and nothing but time for reflection on his hands, Origen ended up devoting his life to discovering Christian truth through the use of reason. And one of the things his reason led him to realize is that if God is good and is love, then no one is going to hell. So he became a Universalist, our first Universalist ancestor. About a century later, another Egyptian scholar, Arius, promoted a Unitarian theology that said God is one and Jesus was human. It seems to me like this could have caught on. Trinitarian theologies are certainly trickier to explain. But the Trinitarians' efforts to counteract Arius were so effective that you can still hear the creeds they developed being recited in churches today. This is where the Nicene Creed came in, and some of you know the Apostles' Creed that followed. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Ghost. Still, Arius' theology did not disappear. Then there was Pelagius, an English monk, also of the 4th century, who believed in free will, the idea that humans have the wisdom and the power to choose between good and evil. Unfortunately, he was overshadowed by his contemporary Augustine, who cooked up the doctrine of original sin that says humans are essentially bad. In Origen, Arius, and Pelagius, we see early glimpses of what are now parts of Unitarian Universalism, that all are from one source, all are saved, and we have free will. These are 3 ideas that persisted over the centuries and showed up in the lives of other UU heroes. One was Michael Servetus, another teenager, this one not as easily thwarted as Origen. During the Reformation, Servetus noticed, as others would, that Jesus never spells out the Trinity in the Gospels. At the age of 19, he told both the Catholic and the newly established Protestant authorities, quote, "Your Trinity is a product of subtlety and madness. The Gospel knows nothing of it." This was terrible timing. The Inquisition was still underway, and John Calvin had him burned at the stake. In 16th century Poland, there was Faustus Socinus, a trusted, maybe charismatic Unitarian who attracted some of the greatest minds of that time with his liberal Unitarian theology, but he also got the attention of the authorities who snuffed out the so-called Socinian controversy, as well as its instigator. That same century in Transylvania, there was the Edict of Torda, passed in 1598 by King John Sigismund. It was the first law of religious tolerance, 1598. UUs today attribute some famous words to this king's court preacher, Francis de Vide, who is quoted as saying, "We need not think alike to love alike." He never said that, but we can. It's a great line, and true. There are still many Unitarian congregations in Transylvania today, and actually January 13th will be the 450th anniversary of the Edict of Torda, and I'll be preaching about that soon after. And now, as we have these strands winding through history, we're getting closer to the present era. In 18th century England, Joseph Priestley, most famous as the scientist who discovered oxygen, was also a Unitarian minister. A brilliant man, he inspired quite a bit of growth in Unitarianism in England, which in turn inspired a mob to torch his home, library, and chapel. Narrowly escaping, he jumped on a ship to join his Unitarian friend Thomas Jefferson in the newly formed United States. And around the same time, one of our most colorful UU ancestors, John Murray, also started out in England. Originally an outspoken fire and brimstone Christian, Murray was converted by reason to Universalist Christianity, and he took up preaching it to others. You know by now that this will not end well. Murray lost his church, along with almost all of his friends and his wife and his only child. After a stint in debtor's prison, the devastated Murray fled to America, and he vowed never to speak of Universalism again because it had cursed his existence so thoroughly. But, as Murray tells the story, God had other plans. His ship got stuck in a sandbar off the coast of New Jersey. Murray wandered on shore, met a man by the name of Thomas Potter, who believed he had been instructed by God to build a chapel in the middle of nowhere, and he had built it. When he heard Murray had been a preacher in England, Potter felt certain that Murray was the man God intended that chapel for. "The winds won't loose your ship until you preach," Potter told him. Remember, Murray had sworn off preaching. They left it to divine providence. If the winds had not changed by Sunday, Murray would preach. They didn't change. And he went on to become known as the grandfather of American Universalism. Meanwhile, American Unitarians were doing their own thing, although they were not yet called Unitarians, or if they were, it was in a derogatory way. Instead, there was a handful of free-thinking congregational ministers in New England whose love of reason gradually led them to question literal interpretations of the Bible, as well as Puritan Calvinism. Calvinists, you may know, believed in predestination. They believed that God had already decided who was saved and who was damned, and since living an immoral life was a sure sign that you were one of the damned, Calvinists tried really hard to be good, to at least look like they were on the winning team, right? Liberal ministers like William Ellery Channing, Theodore Parker, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, on the other hand, believed in free will, like Pelagius. Soon, Emerson grew too radical for the Unitarians of his time, and eventually they refused to let him preach in Unitarian churches anymore. He had become a transcendentalist, along with the likes of Henry David Thoreau, as they say it in Concord, where Henry David Thoreau is from, Margaret Fuller, and Bronson Alcott, the father of Louisa May, who wrote the literary classic Little Women. Transcendentalists found the divine through nature and direct experience more than through Scripture. Eventually, other Unitarians also came to regard the Bible as just one sacred text among many, a widely misunderstood source of ancient wisdom, but not of literal authority. And many UUs still feel that way today. Christianity led to Unitarianism, Unitarianism led to Transcendentalism, and Transcendentalism, in turn, with its vague notion of the divine and its deep appreciation of nature, made room in our tradition for the humanist movement toward the end of the 19th century. Each of these changes was perceived as very radical and even upsetting when they occurred. Humanists attempted to reformulate liberal religion on completely rational, non-theistic grounds. This prompted some other Unitarians to try to agree on a statement of belief to rein in all this changing. A number of versions were suggested, many of which included God, but some ministers protested that without God or any shared belief, Unitarianism would cease to be a religion. There's that fear. But they didn't want a creed. They really did value tolerance. By the mid-20th century, around the time the Unitarian and Universalist denominations merged, a rational, atheistic humanism had come to dominate most UU congregations in the western half of the U.S. The use of ritual faded away. There were no candles or prayers, and sermons, if they were even called sermons, were very intellectual. Churches were called congregations or fellowships, not churches. Reason and science were paramount, and the belief that humans were ultimately responsible for their own condition and the condition of the earth reinforced a strong commitment to social justice. The social justice emphasis is a gift from our humanist era that we should never forget. But from this period, we also learned that statements of disbelief can take on almost as much power as creeds sometimes. I was raised as a UU, and I learned religious tolerance in Sunday school along with diverse ideas about God. But as a young person, I remember understanding that use of the word God among adults in my church was frowned upon and invited criticism. Gradually, ritual was reintroduced. UU women's groups had a lot to do with that. And in the early 2000s, there was a push to re-embrace what they called language of reverence, to bring poetry and metaphor back into our religious services, and to truly embrace the whole theological and atheological diversity within our congregations, in which for some people the direct experience of transcending mystery and wonder is a direct experience of God, while for others it is a direct experience of life, of loveliness, of the good. In these distinct and weaving threads that make up the history of our UU timeline, you can see many of the stories and values that still make up Unitarian Universalist Church as it is today. Like Arius, UUs on the main believe that people are from the same source, one family. Some call that source God. Others, like the humanists of the mid-20th century, feel it's better explained in natural or scientific terms. Some leave it undefined, and that's okay too. Like Origen and John Murray, UUs tend to believe that all will be reconciled with that source. We're born from it, and we return to it. Maybe we're never as far from it as we think. And like Origen, we embrace the use of reason in the path of meaning and truth. You'll find that, like the Transcendentalists, UU churches draw much from the natural world and direct experience. You will have noticed by now that I'm using a lot of tend tos and on the main. That's because not all UUs believe the same things. We really don't have to think alike to love alike. You can disagree with me on theological points or other points and still be 100% Unitarian Universalist and a beloved member of this community. In fact, if you respectfully share a different view or information with me, I'll be glad for the chance to get to know you. In the beginning, I pointed to the far left side of this timeline and I spoke of the ancient question, what does it mean? What does it mean to be alive? That's one thing that has not changed. Over many thousands of years, we still struggle and wonder and marvel at being alive. Unitarian Universalism is a big embrace of that questioning and seeking. It's a living tradition with roots as old as life itself and ideas as new as the latest scientific discovery. Whoever you are, wherever you are on your spiritual journey, I'm glad you're here. Welcome. Please rise in body or spirit for hymn number 318 in the gray hymnal, We Would Be One.
And our closing words today come from Olympia Brown. She lived from 1835 to 1926 and was a minister. Stand by this faith, work for it, and sacrifice for it. There is nothing in all the world so important as to be loyal to this faith, which has placed before us the loftiest ideals, which has comforted us in sorrow, strengthened us for noble duty, and made the world beautiful.